Hello, good morning, everyone. This is the Interface X team from Empathy Co. And what are we doing here today? We are connecting the Interface X components to the Spotify endpoints to create a search experience. But before everything, what is the Interface X library? It's a standalone configurable building blocks that allow you to quickly construct the search UI for your shop, and you can create a smooth and personalized search and discovery experience while minimizing the development time. And how are we going to connect the components to the Spotify today? We are using the archetype, which is our default layer with default configurations and styling of the components. And when you want to start a new search experience, you can start from the components, which would be like having a white canvas where you start placing components, or you can start from the archetype, which already has configurations, styling, so you can start from something that is already working to modify it. And in the archetype, in the architecture, there is this part of the adapter that you can see there. And this is the part that we are going to play with today, because we are not playing with the front-end visual parts. We are just changing the part that connects to the API and transform the response to be understood by the components. So before we start, just I would like to introduce you Daniel from Open Source Connections, who is here today to understand how Interface X components can connect to any API. Hi, Daniel. Good morning.
Hey, good morning.
So I pass it to Ivan, who is going to be conducting the coding. So that's it. Ivan, if you want to share,
Yeah, I'm sharing.
that's it.
Okay, so let's start. Okay, I will introduce you how to connect the X components to Spotify API. Okay, for searching songs, albums, artists, and we start. Our starting point is this project. We call it Archetype. Okay, we have here the project. That is a view project using the X components inside with everything configured and with all things working on with our own API. Okay, so we can start here and we can look for t-shirt. We have results. We have faceting. Okay, we can filter. We have pagination. Okay, and we will do the same, but with the API of Spotify. Okay. So, as Gerardo said, the component that interacts between the X components and the API is the adapter. Okay, we use by default our platform adapter, that is the pre-configured adapter that works with our API, with Empathy API. Okay, we will replace this adapter with a new one. Okay, that works with the Spotify API. So the first step, I have all the code pre-coded, okay, but because if I type everything, I will miss some parts and make mistakes. Okay, we have here a new file, Spotify adapter. Okay, we are doing this in TypeScript because we have the help of the types to configure and to type and to code everything. Okay, and we have an adapter that is exported and used in the X components. Okay, this adapter has an interface. As you can see, there are many methods here to request different endpoints. Okay, each one of these methods is requesting an endpoint of our API and returning a response. Okay, today we are going to focus on search. Okay, and if we have time at the end, I will try to connect also the recommendations. The search is the default search endpoint to retrieve results, and the recommendations are endpoint we have to return the top click at the top most viewed results from the users. Okay, So we start with the search. For the search, we get the same adapter we have, the platform adapter, and we override the search endpoint. To create a new endpoint to a new API, we have an utils function, a method, okay, endpoint adapter factory. What it does is takes a configuration, okay, and returns a function. And what this function does is receiving a search request, okay, and returning a promise of search response. These both types are the types of X components, okay. These are types that we are exposing from components to make everything works with to make X components to understand the response and the request. Okay, and we are transforming this request and this response to and from the API. Okay, so this new API, the configuration for creating this search endpoint adapter. The first configuration is the URL, okay, the endpoint that we are using. This is the Spotify API, and some options to do during the request. In this case, we can set the headers of the request, okay, and we have here a method get token, okay, that is the simplest way to get the token of the authentication of Spotify. We are creating a URL with the client ID, and when we accept the OAuth authentication, it redirects back with the access token in the URL. We use directly from there, and we don't have logic to get a new access token when this token is no longer working, but we can remove from the URL and request another. I keep it this as much as simple as possible, okay, to focus on the other part. So with this change, if we go to localhost directly as before, it redirects to the OAuth of Spotify. Okay, so if I agree, we have the access token, okay, in the URL, and if we look for something, okay, we don't see anything, okay, because we didn't map yet the the response. We are mapping the request. Okay, this is a mapper for the request. What is a mapper? A mapper is another function that the endpoint adapter uses inside to map the response or the request of the API. Okay, in this case, this request mapper it is just a function that receives the set request parameters. Okay, in this case, we get the query, the start, and the rows. This is for pagination. Okay, and we return the parameters that the API accepts. In this case, the queue for the query, the limit for the number of the results, the offset for the starting results number. Also, there is another parameter track with the value track, which is type. Okay, this parameter is mandatory from the Spotify API. It requires this parameter always. You cannot search without this parameter. So we are looking for songs, okay, for tracks. And as you can see, this is just a function that receives some object with parameters and transform to another object with parameters. Okay, this is what we call a mapper. And if we reload again, we can see in the network tab of the DevTools, we are actually requesting the search API of Spotify, okay, and we are receiving tracks, okay. We already have here songs with all the information, but we are not showing it because we didn't map the response yet. We only map the request from the X components to the API. Okay, if we go to the next step, okay, we transform this mapper, this request mapper, with another function we have with another factory that transforms a configuration object like this, that is very similar what the function did before. And this function, this method, this factory returns the previous function that we have. The advantage of this is we have types here. We have the shared request and we have the types. These types are installed uh, from the types of Spotify API. Okay, we have TypeScript types from API of Spotify, so it can help us to configure this object. Okay, for example, if I remove what parameter is the query, it shows the error, but we also have all the parameters that the search request offers. In this case, the search, the query, the origin, the sort. But we also have, if we remove these parameters from the request, okay, we can autocomplete with the parameters that the search for this type of Spotify request needs. Okay, the mandatory are the query, the type, and we can send the offset and the limit, and we are using it to use pagination. So in this case, we have already the parameters. And as you can see, if we try to use some parameter that is not of the type, because the offset is number, okay, and we use the sort that is a string, we have an error of TypeScript. So TypeScript is helping us to not make mistakes in order to configure this mapping between the API and the search response. Of course, because we are using types. The types are not mandatory. We could use any type because if we don't have the API types, we don't have to use it. We don't have the help, okay, but we could use anyway this function. So I go back to the changes to have it at the boss. Okay, so we have the request mapper and using the request mapper in the adapter endpoint that we created before. Next step. Okay, we have the request mapped, but we need the response to be mapped to be understood from the X components. So we create a new response mapper using the same factory we use for the request, but in this case, it's transforming the Spotify response to the X components search response. And what this search response needs? Okay, we need the total results, okay, which is the number of total results, which is in this path. As you can see, here is not only the simple attributes, but we can have a path to the data. Directly. We have in the response, we have the total inside an object called tracks. Okay. Results. Okay, the results is the list of results that we need. Okay, and how we map it? Well, we have this path and subschema. This all is a way to configure this factory to return the suitable function to map the response. Okay, so we the items from the tracks object, and we apply to each one of these items this subschema. Okay, which is repeating the schema of like the request. Okay, so for each item inside this array, we are mapping this. We have the model name, which is a function returning a string. Why is a function returning a string? Well, this is the way of returning a constant string. Okay, we are not returning a field in the response called result. No, we are returning always the string result. This is needed for X components to understand the type of the result that we will use because our component supports multiple different results like banners or promoted results or other kinds of results. In this example, we are focusing only on the result. Another field that we need is ID that in Spotify it's the same name, which is the identifier, the unique identifier for that result. The name of the result that we are going to display and the URL of this result. In this case, this is the URL of the song to the Spotify web page. Okay, the images. The images are an array of strings of URLs to showing all the images for a result. In this case, we are mapping using a function. This is something also supported for the schema mapper factory. Okay, we take the response. In this case, is the full result. And in the case of the Spotify API, the image of a song is not directly in the song, but in the album. So we take all the album images and map the URL. So what we have here inside the images at the end is an array with the URLs of the images. Okay, so we have the response mapper. We pass it as an option to the search endpoint adapter, okay, which is used for the search. And if you go back, we have already results. Okay. If we go to the initial page, we have here some carousels, okay, with pre-configured queries. We call this preview results. Okay, we have the query backpack. Luckily, in Spotify, there is always results. Nevertheless, the query you use. Okay, so we have already other components, not only the search results, working directly with the API of Spotify. Okay, so if I look for some song, we have the songs. Okay, and if I scroll down, we have pagination. Okay, we are in the page 2. In the page 3, we have the pagination of the search working also. Okay, next step. As I said before, the type is mandatory in the request of the API of Spotify, but we can send multiple values here. We can send track, we can send artist, we can send album to search for different kind of results. So maybe we can use that to filter results instead of searching only track, we can search for track and albums. For that, we can configure. We can configure the facets. The facets are, in our case, in our API, usually these facets are returning from the API directly. Okay, but the Spotify API doesn't have this kind of faceting for filtering the results. But we can hard code, okay, in the response. As we map the results, we can map something you can see here that is a function, like in the case of model name, okay? So we are returning this directly, this array of facets, okay? And this is following our simple facet model, okay? We have multiple types of facet like range facets or hierarchical facets, but in this case, we use a simple facet. Okay, in the simple facet, we need the model name to say what type of facet it is, an ID. In this case, we use type because we want to filter the type of the request, the label that will be shown, and the filters, an array of filters. In this case, we have a filter for the track, a filter for the album, and a filter for the artist. Okay? And what we do in the request, instead of returning directly the track type, okay, we get the filters from the search request coming from X components, and we map it. This transformation is because the filters we have is an object, a dictionary, a record, where the filters are grouped by facet. But here, as we are only using one facet and one filter, we can flat it in only one array and send the ID. Remember that the ID is actually the value of the track that we have to send to the API. And we are mapping that and join them with a comma, okay? In case there is not filters, okay, remember that the type is mandatory in the Spotify API. So in case we don't filter, we search for tracks directly. Okay, so if I go back again, accept the auth. If I look for a song, we have here a panel with the facet displayed and with the 3 filters already. So I can filter for track, I can filter for album, and I can filter for artist. But if I remove the filter of track, we have no results. Why? Oh, it's because the search response of the API is not returning the results in the same place. We have albums inside the albums object, artist inside the artist object, and tracks inside a tracks object. We are only mapping tracks. Okay, so in the last response, if we don't have tracks, we don't have results. We have to rethink how to map the response to show albums and artists too. Okay, let's do that. And the next step, okay, go back to the code. We are changing the response mapper that we before had with this factory, okay, with this schema and this configuration. We're changing it to see what is in the response of the API. In case there is tracks, I map the response tracks, okay? In case I have albums, I map the response albums. In case I have artists, the same, okay? If the API responds in the same as usually as Elastic API search does, that returns the same documents in the same position, in the same object, we didn't have to do this, but in this case we have this. But we can do it easily, okay? We have this simple mapper response that checks what is in the response and use this object response mapper that is the name what that we gave to the new mapper, okay? That is using directly the same that we have, okay? And in case that there is no tracks, albums, or artists, in this case it won't happen, but in that case we return an empty response with no results and no total results. Okay, so another thing. What happens if I filter by tracks and albums at the same time? Okay, as you can see, I only return tracks. I cannot return tracks and albums at the same time. I could map the response and concatenate them, but you only see the tracks at the beginning and albums before that. So I only want to show or tracks or albums or artists. So how I configure in X components a facet to be single select. I mean, if I select a new filter, deselect the previous filter, please. So we have one line for that. Okay, we have a filter entity factory that is the factory that creates filters behind the scenes. Okay, and we are just registering a single select modifier for the facet with the ID type. Okay, remember that we put in the facet the real ID type. And with that, if I reload again, okay, if I search for again for the and I filter, okay, I can filter for tracks, but I can filter for album, and I get albums, and I can filter for artist. And for artist, I don't have anything for this query, but if I look for YouTube, for example, I have the artist YouTube, okay, the artist, okay, and the album and the track. And as you can see, whenever I click on a filter, the other is selected, okay. And if I deselect all the filters, I get the songs, because by default, it returns the songs. So we have the search working with the search API of Spotify. We have faceting, we have pagination. So it's pretty much what we need for looking for songs and artists.
I would like you to show how changing the searching point, the feature which is at the home of the search, or
Yes. Yes. Yes.
meaning it's a feature that gets a query and creates a carousel for each query. So as this feature is also using the searching point that we just modified, we are using the searching point from Spotify for this as well.
Yes. Whenever we have an X component using that endpoint, that feature of searching, in this case, we are using it, it is already configured, of course, not only for the search. Okay, and last, I told you that I wanted to configure the search, but I want also to configure the recommendations. So that's the step. We do the same. We override the recommendations endpoint from our platform adapter to map and to request instead of our API, the newer API, and I create directly here a recommendations endpoint adapter with the recommendations API endpoint, the headers, and the request in this case doesn't need a query. The recommendations, it needs a sheet. Okay, it can be a genre sheet, an artist sheet, I think a song, but in this case I hard coded the rock. Okay, so all the recommendations will be rock songs, and just mapping the response of this recommendations endpoint as we do with the search. Okay, just taking the tracks, the result, the URL, the images, and we have in this case the recommendations. Where are displayed the recommendations? Well, here in this predictive layer, we have a preview of the top songs that this recommendations endpoint returns. Also, if we don't get any results, okay, we have also the recommendations just to show something instead of a white page. And I think it's pretty much everything.
Yeah, I think so. So fast that
So maybe a question. So if I wanted to connect not the Spotify API, but maybe Solar, Elasticsearch, OpenSearch, because these are the search engines that we deal a lot with, and I guess you at Empathy as well, would we follow the same steps basically at least? So mapping the requests, mapping the responses, or are there already predefined things that we could use?
Yes, the way to do is the adapter works as a middleman in the between the X components and the API. So it transforms the request and the response. If the request is complicated and it's an object and it can be done with this, we have these factories, okay, to make it easier for us to map things. But this at the end it is a function that receives an object and returns another object. So it can be a hard-coded function. It doesn't need to be an schema factory or adapter or whatever. Even the endpoint adapter doesn't have to be used this factory. It can be a function that receives the request from X components and does the request behind the scenes with whatever you need for behind and returns a promise of the response. The only thing we have to accomplish is that the request that received is using this format, this type, okay, and the response must be in this way. We have to have results, we have to have facets, other things that we support, like spell check, for example, the total results, redirections, whatever, and the result have to have this kind of format. Of course, these types can be augmented. If you need a new field in the result that is not here,
Okay.
it can be added. Okay, it's not restricted.
so at the end of the day, all these tools are to help the developer to do it faster, quickly, with more confidence. But you just need to map, as we see, uh, your object to the object that is understood for the adapter and the endpoint, and the same for the response.
Okay, cool. Thanks. And maybe a look into the future. So what are features that you are looking into maybe extending or introducing in the next, well, probably not a couple of days or weeks, but maybe a couple of months?
Well, we are dealing always every day with new challenges, and doing this with Spotify, for example, we get this. Okay, we have different parts of the response with the results we get. Maybe we can simplify this, okay, with a new configuration or whatever in the schema, so we can do this faster without doing this. Also, we have improved to make in some parts of these schemas. But as I said, this schemas is just a helper to go faster. It's not needed to use it. And in terms of X components, well, we have plenty of future features to include.
We are working on a design system that it's a little bit the same concept as the adapter but for
styling.
For styling. That you have many tools to help you to provide new experiences with new styles and everything without having to code all the CSS. You have predefined tools to do that. We have in mind also features about visualization for shoppers like product review, or we are working on another things like suggestions with filters. So we are working in many ways. Some of them to help us to get a faster time to market, and some of them focus on the shoppers and on the experience.
Okay, good, thanks.
And I think we are done. I mean, it's so fast that sometimes it seems that has not much value. But for me, that I see Ivan working on this and changing from our endpoints to Spotify in just 30 minutes. I know the code was already there, but at the end of the day, it's one file of code to create, to map the request and the response. So it's pretty cool to do this in half an hour and have this experience. I'm going to share
Stop share.
the repo. No, just in the Twitch chat, I have shared the repo where we have this code with this Spotify demo. And that would be all for today. So thank you very much to everybody who has came was in the Twitch session, and see you in the next one.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Bye bye.